On October 19th, 1781, General Lord Cornwallis and his British Army surrendered to an American force under the command of George Washington and Rochambeau at Yorktown. After a long and arduous campaign that had taken the British Army through the Carolinas and to Virginia, they had finally been caught and besieged by this Franco-American force. The surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown marked a major turning point in the American Revolution. Indeed, when George III heard the news that Lord Cornwallis had surrendered, he exclaimed, "Good God, it is all over." Well, as usual, the king was wrong. It wasn't over. The American Revolution did not end at Yorktown. The war would continue for 2 more years, in a time when the end of the war was still and would remain in doubt. No one understood better that Yorktown was not the end of the war than the commander-in-chief himself. Shortly after the surrender of Lord Cornwallis, Washington wrote to his friend, Governor Nelson of Virginia. He wrote to the governor that what he feared was that instead of exciting our exertions, the victory at Yorktown will produce such a relaxation in the prosecution of the war as will prolong the calamities of it. A few days later, he wrote to the American commander in the South, General Nathanael Greene, expressing the same sentiments. Washington feared that the good news from Yorktown would push the Americans to relax their effort against the king, and that in that relaxation, the revolution might yet be lost. After taking Cornwallis's surrender, Washington returned to Mount Vernon for a brief respite. It was, in fact, only the second time that he had been home during the entire years of the Revolution. After spending a few days at Mount Vernon, he and Martha journeyed to Philadelphia. His plan was to spend the winter of 1781-1782 with the Congress. He knew that he needed to persuade them that the war was not over, and to persuade them and to encourage them to continue their support for the effort. He arrived in Philadelphia to the acclaim of all of the citizens. He was indeed the conquering hero. Parades, banquets, they even wrote an opera in his honor. Washington was enthralled with the attention. To be sure, he enjoyed it a bit, but he was also troubled. He did not attend sessions of Congress. That would have been inappropriate. He was, after all, the commander-in-chief, not a member of that body. But every Monday night, he and certain other key figures would meet at the home of Robert Morris, the superintendent of finance. There, in Mr. Morris's quarters, Washington, the Secretary at War, Benjamin Lincoln, occasionally James Madison, a young member of the Congress, would meet to discuss the major issues confronting the Congress and the new nation. The principal one was money. The Congress had run out of money and had little or no way to get more. They had no power of taxation. The only power they had was to ask the Congress, rather to ask the states to send them money. By this time, late in the war, the states were exhausted themselves. They had little to send and sent very little. After several weeks spending winter in Philadelphia, Washington finally decided that it was time for him to return to his army. The American army had left Virginia after Cornwallis's surrender and had marched to the Hudson River just north of New York City and taken up a position there. They chose that site because the British still occupied New York City, and from the heights along the Hudson, they could observe the British and prevent them from leaving the city. Before he left, Washington returned to the Congress to ask their permission to depart. They granted permission to the commander-in-chief and then told him, quote, "We have nothing particular to give you and have appointed this audience only to assure you of our esteem and confidence and to wish you happiness and success." And with that happiness and success, Washington left to rejoin the army. He went to the Hudson encampment, and there he found an army in distress. He found an army that had not been paid, an army that wondered why they were still in the field, for they too thought the war was over. At the same time, the British in New York City were strong. The British had recently welcomed a new commander-in-chief of His Majesty's forces in North America, General Sir Guy Carleton. Carleton had under his command, as a garrison in that city, more troops than all of the American army combined. But Carleton had arrived with orders from the ministry that he was not to undertake any offensive operations. For by this time, in Parliament, in London, war weariness had set in. The king, stubborn as always, would not give in to any thought of American independence, but at the same time there was a growing furor within Parliament that demanded an end to this reckless war, as some refer to it. And so for the moment then, it was a waiting position. General Carleton within the confines of New York City, watching, waiting. General Washington with his army outside New York City, watching and waiting.